The next speaker is Nuray Mert.
Hi. Does it work? Just turn it on. I did. So it works. Okay. First of all, I want to apologize. It was really embarrassing for me of being a very punctual person to be late. And I keep speakers. I hate speakers who keep people waiting. And it's a very rare thing, really. I mean, believe me. And very rarely I decide to take my time. And in each case, I end up being extremely embarrassed like it happened today. And of being the last speaker, one has to be very confident to agree with being the last speaker. This is not my case. I just have been very unfortunate. So, turned to be the last speaker. And finally, I have to warn you about one of my weaknesses of being tempted by discussing with other speakers rather than giving my own speech and all. That's why I want to start with the last speaker's speech, and probably it may make it more lively and can be an excuse for my replying the last speaker. But I have to say that I'm really surprised what Professor Ronald Mert said, not because he has been critical. I'm not expecting from anybody to be all supportive of Kurdish cause or Kurdish politics and all that. And I'm not someone who is not critical of Kurdish politics or Kurdish resistance movement or anything. And I think criticism is very, very useful for any political movement, for any debate on anything. But why I'm kind of surprised by his criticism or that, sorry, Professor, but it turns to be a kind of, from criticism it turns to be not being politically correct when you say Kurdish politics or narrative is primitive, or Kurds, they don't have good history, or Öcalan is bit, confused mind, who is not a good partner. Okay, this is what I heard, that the speech ended as like Kurds, they don't have a good story, and Kurds, they don't have a good representative to present their case, and they must have clear vision and program. It's not a personal thing. We hear it a lot in Turkey. That's why I decided to start with that, because this is what we have in Turkey, and this is what we face up with in our debates on Kurdish issue in Turkey. So it is an important thing to be discussed. That there are many commentators, both pro-government and democratic.
Sorry, Nora, they can't hear at the back.
Can I what?
A little bit closer to the microphone, perhaps.
Out of order, with due respect. Now, let the speaker present her presentation and the discussions and criticism of other speakers during questions and answers.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am free to do whatever I like. And we are not here like, presenting ourselves.
Okay, can you please, at the back, please? Let the speaker finish, yeah. Sorry.
Keep your ideas to yourself. And anyway, I was planning to start with the last decade. So that's why I decided to discuss the last speakers, because he also discussed the last episode in Turkish politics, like the beginning of the process of democratization. And it was my plan, and the title is Democracy Deficit, and all Kurdish issue and all that. So it's not, I didn't promise you to talk about, Chinese music in Angola in 1970s. So this is what I promised to talk about. So I will think that it's quite unpolite to warn me again if you attempt to. I actually as well try planning to talk about, not about the whole history about Kurds living under Turkish rule or history of Turkish repressions or Kurdish struggles and resistances. We all know about all these. My suggestion would be, and still is, to focus on the last decade in Turkey, because after all we witnessed a very major and perhaps radical transformation of Turkish politics. Starting with, in the last 10 years, starting with 2002 general elections, when Justice and Development Party came to power. And actually, it is seen as the beginning of democratization process in Turkey, since Justice and Democratic Party promised to fight, or, even if they didn't promise, it was obvious that they would fight against the status quo, because they faced up a lot of repressions, and they had been struggling against the status quo and against all threats coming from this secularist authoritarian hegemony in Turkey. And it was a democratic victory, actually, that they came to power in 2002. And it was very fair and hopeful in a way. I was among the hopefuls, not because I thought that they're the perfect Democrats, but as like many other Turkish Democrats and leftists and liberals, I thought that, well, since they represent a force against status quo, they will open a gate for more democratization, and they would promise a kind of, despite themselves, despite of their shortcomings, they could open a space for further democratization. But and in the first term, it went on like that, since they were still struggling with the status quo forces, and still there was this threat of military coup d'etat that they had to overcome. And then even in their second term, they faced up with closure case by the Constitutional Court. And while they were struggling with the status quo forces, like in the shape of military or judiciary, they were still kind of in opposition, if you like, vis-à-vis the status quo, vis-à-vis the this secularist, authoritarian, Turkish political system or whatever regime, if you like. But once they managed to overcome the whole obstacles on their way, it turned to be a total transformation of power from one authoritarian system or regime or power to another. It was true that it was the victory of civil politics over militaristic politics and militaristic secularist politics, but not all civil victories are democratic victories. Not all rises of civil politics lead to the rise of democratization or democracy in a country. And the perfect case is Turkey. It is clear that we witnessed the rise of and victory of civil politics over military politics of the time. And at the end we also came to the point of realizing that actually it was not even the end of militaristic politics. It was a defeat of the previous military or militaristic forces. And now we have different type of militarism under the thumb of civil government, the present government. So that's why we ended up very badly. And that's why actually there is this paradox of Western observers, as Professor Mert mentioned. Western observers are still presenting, less and less so though, presenting the good picture of Turkey. And they still think of kind of very hopeful democratization in Turkey. But at the same time, for the last 2 years, it started to be a bit different. And Turkey started to show its ugly face that nobody can deny anymore. That's why it poses a paradox that, on one side there is this, story of success, story of, success of democratization, and the best transformation or whatever in the Middle East. And then there are all these, reportings and all that, and indexes, media indexes, freedom of speech, limitations and all that. And they start to bother everybody, including those hopefuls in the Western world. So, and now it seems as if, there is a paradox that, Turkey was on the right track. And suddenly, what happened, what went wrong kind of thing. But actually, it is understandable why it turned to be like this if we look at the story of this process of democratization, as I am suggesting, that there was a hope for more democratization, but at some stage, it turned to be just sheer transformation of power from one kind of power coalition to another, from one authoritarian understanding under the name of secularist nationalism to conservative nationalism, and from secularist authoritarianism to conservative authoritarianism, from secularist militarism towards conservative militarism. So that's why, especially after this total takeover of power, after the last constitutional amendments in 2000, passed by a referendum in 2010, this Justice and Development Party, or this new political elite, felt confident enough, and anyway, they managed to take the whole power in political system, and then it turned to be actually the process of transformation of power from one hegemony to another has completed, and then it started to be like, it turned to be more visible. But it was its own way, actually. I mean, this government has never been very tolerant of criticism, and they had a lot of failings in terms of democratic politics, even before. But at the time, they had all sorts of excuses, and Turkish Democrats were quite talented in legitimizing democracy deficits and their, failures of Justice of Democracy Party, and finding all sorts of excuses to cover up all these deficits. But from the beginning of the transformation of power, or from 2010 constitutional amendments on, it turned to be impossible, almost impossible, to cover democracy deficits. And on the other hand, Justice and Development Party, the Prime Minister himself, felt free to express total control and to express his understanding of democracy and his understanding of politics in general. So that's why it also concerns the process of Kurdish opening or Kurdish issue, and it also gives an answer to the question of why it failed. I'm not saying that Justice and Development Party and Prime Minister himself has been hypocritical from the beginning. But even at the time, on the eve of the Kurdish opening, so-called Kurdish opening of 2009, I was thinking that, it will lead to a total failure. And I wrote about that, and I faced up with severe criticism, including by Kurds, who chose to be hopeful, and everybody accused me of being pessimistic, or even kind of being a kind of hindrance, as if I have the capacity to stop Kurdish opening by being pessimistic. But anyhow, I knew that. I was very supportive of a process of opening or whatever to solve the Kurdish question in democratic and peaceful way. But I knew the framework of the Kurdish opening in 2009. I knew the limits of the framework, because it all stems from the understanding of Kurdish question on behalf of the government, on behalf of the governing party, on behalf of the Prime Minister himself. And they have never been malicious or hypocritical. But the basic thing was their understanding of Kurdish question was very limited. And they thought that the basic problem comes from the secularist nation states' handling of Kurdish population. Since the majority of Kurds were, and still are, quite religious and conservative, whatever, if a conservative party convinced Kurds that, okay, all has gone, now, secularist hegemony is removed, and they can feel free to live peacefully under Turkish rule with their Turkish Muslim brothers and sisters, and everything would be settled. This was the idea from the beginning. That's why it didn't have any chance. It didn't stand a chance of success. And then that's why, again, when it didn't work, and in their mind, of course, it was not only calling Kurds to live peacefully and to live all sorts of means of struggle, and they thought that, okay, if we also introduce few reforms like TRT6 Kurdish TV channel, and then emphasize human rights, and if we switch to more multinational idea of state, it will be done. And this is what they tried to do, and failed altogether, because it didn't satisfy, could not satisfy the demands of Kurds. And the issue there was not individual freedoms or cultural freedoms or establishing a multicultural state, but the issue was political status and collective rights and so on. So and Kurds were not expecting benevolence from the government. They were expecting to be recognized as representatives of their cause or demands and demands of freedom. And on the other hand, the government behaved like a benevolent ruler. That's why they also often reminded the Ottoman model of coexistence. And many democratic hopefuls, including Western observers of Turkey, they regarded this recalling of Ottoman model as a positive sign as a good inspiration for a multicultural politics and pluralistic society and all that. But at least this recalling of Ottoman past meant a new version of Turkish nationalism, if you like. Because, well, okay, I mean, there was too much emphasis on peaceful coexistence of different races or, ethnicities or whatever cultures. But it was always, thought to be under Turkish rule. And the Turkish rule has always been glorified by any talk of Ottoman model or by any reference to Ottoman model. And that's why, I mean, okay, if Kemalist nationalism was limited with Turkishness and limited with the boundaries of Turkey, the new one didn't feel like limit itself with the boundaries of Turkey, nor being so modest about just, ruling Turks or, assimilating Kurds. But also, I mean, it turned to be even a kind of irredentist nationalism. It also relates to our foreign policy. And it also, explains why Turkey behaves like this in Syria and how it is related to Kurdish issue. So that's why the Kurdish issue would not be able to solve. And on the contrary, it turned to be even worse and worse and worse and come to this point. Actually, this is a very hopeful day because of the end of hunger strikes. But, I mean, still, I think we need to talk about the shortcomings of Turkish political system and present government and Turkish politics to be able to understand the extent of the problem and to be able to see the prospects of the solution of Kurdish issue or prospects of possible Kurdish political status and Turkish democracy, of course. As for constitution, by the way, I don't think that Turkey is in a position to write a constitution under the circumstances and to try to solve its problem with the Kurdish population or with the Kurds, with political Kurds rather, through this new constitution, because we are not on that yet. And even if it's possible to write a new constitution, it is bound to be a transitional constitution to give more space for negotiations and debate, and then we can move on. And I think this is the most important aspect of the whole thing. If we could manage to write a constitution, and if we could manage to comprehend the fact that it could be only a transitional constitution. And anyhow, going back to the beginning, actually, in the first panel, it's Mr. Brian Curran reminded the basic thing the basic thing about Kurdish problem and or Turkish problem or Turkey's problem with Kurds is the recognition of the fact that it is a political crisis and it is a matter of Kurds asking for political status rather than multinational state or multilingual state or a benevolent democracy, benevolent conservative politics. The basic first step and the essential step and indeed a fact is that unless Turkish present government, the Prime Minister, all Turkish politicians, including the opposition party, and then all circles of political circles, including NGOs, who are quite supportive of Kurdish question, because in many cases, I think that they also fail to understand that it should start with the discussion of political status, rather than going around this language rights, and or some cultural freedoms, because after all, language rights, I mean, the right to speak Kurdish in the court or in education system, it's inseparable part of Kurdish autonomy. Otherwise, I mean, we can't really realize, I mean, all these demands. So these are inseparable from each other. Nowadays, most of the Turkish intellectuals, they feel free to be supportive of Kurdish demands, but they decline to recognize the fact that, I mean, all these rights that the Kurds are claiming or Kurdish political movement is claiming are inseparable from the idea of democratic autonomy, if you like, or some sort of federation or some sort of political status. So that's why, actually, it was a very good introduction of Mr. Curran to say that the basic thing, the basic fact is realization or recognition, rather than denying this fact, recognition of the fact that we should start with discussing political status and discussing negotiations for which will end up with some sort of political status. Thank you. Sorry of being...
No, thank you.